So I'm going to look at chapters 4 and 5 of Alistair MacIntyre's After Virtue today, and I'm going to group that under the general theme of groping for moral certitude, because MacIntyre seems to think that in the modern period that we have been just doing just that, groping for moral certitude, but with tools that don't allow us to get there. Chapter 4 is entitled The Predecessor Culture and the Enlightenment Project of Justifying Morality, and he spends most of the time in this chapter on a critique of the Enlightenment Project of Justifying Morality. There's this poignant moment early on in the chapter where he says, well, we got to a certain point where things obviously changed when we could hear the Catholic Mass sung and appreciate it as an aesthetic thing, for the pure artistry of it, and without any necessary religious understanding or religious connotations. And then he refers to what to Charles Taylor is called disenchantment, when he says it is only in the later 17th century and the 18th century when this distinguishing of the moral from the theological, the legal from the aesthetic, has become a received doctrine, that the project of an independent rational justification of morality becomes not merely the concern of individual thinkers, but central to Northern European culture. So it was only at a certain point in modernity when people's, say, intellect and will had become, at least in their minds, detached from certain anchors that had existed in the past, namely God and nature, I think, that they began to ask themselves, well, on what basis can we derive our morality? And so during the Enlightenment, he says, it became important, very important for the philosophers, the number one task, to establish morality on some independent basis. And that generally broke down to either the basis of the human will, emotions, or on the basis of human reason, both of which were deemed to be unassisted by something higher than themselves. So he talks a little bit about existentialism through Soren Kierkegaard, and he says that Kierkegaard characterized this level of modernity by talking about the self, dividing the self into many masks, none of which was really the true self. And I think the idea there is that the existentialists did not think there was any bottom line. There was no, self that was true. We could be many things, but we were ultimately nothing. There was no fixed content to the human being. But he says Kierkegaard still wanted somehow to argue that the ethical life was superior to the life of just whatever we felt at the moment. And for instance, he says that the ethical life is kind of characterized paradigmatically by marriage as opposed to the life of following one's feelings, which is maybe represented by the romantic affair. And Kierkegaard wanted to say that the ethical life was preferable to the life of just pursuing one's feelings. But the problem was that Kierkegaard, as an existentialist, couldn't provide a fixed reason for choosing marriage over an affair. It was more of a preference, or maybe even a prejudice. If people in the existentialist scheme are making radical and groundless choices because there is no grounding to be had, then people are more likely probably to choose affairs over marriage, or at the very least, it really won't matter which of those choices they make. So MacIntyre says that Kierkegaard's preference, and I think that you can just extrapolate existentialists generally, their preference for the ethical, assumed without being able to prove or even attempting to prove that there were higher and lower modes of living. And so assumption doesn't equal proof, and Kierkegaard's preference for the ethical just wasn't supported by his existentialism. And so MacIntyre argues that basically Kierkegaard's preference for the ethical is a hangover from earlier moral standards, namely Christianity as it was influenced by Aristotelianism in the Middle Ages, that's the heritage, and Kierkegaard and other existentialists still were living with those preferences as a sort of prejudice, but they had become unmoored from the reasons and the rationales behind those preferences. And so therefore their argument didn't ultimately hold up. It wasn't consistent. He says it is certainly just this deeply incoherent combination of the novel, the new, and the inherited, the old Aristotelian Christian heritage, which is the logical outcome of the Enlightenment's project to provide a rational foundation for and justification of morality. Well, then, true to his plan, he then moves backwards a little bit, and he says that Kant kind of represents the quintessential Enlightenment theorist. Kant sets the stage for Kierkegaard and existentialism, because for Kant, what counts as rational religion forms the background for Kierkegaard's Christianity. That is, Kant characterizes religion in a way that lends itself to Kierkegaard's construal of Christianity as a choice, as a sort of arbitrary choice. Kant argues that the basis of morality must be found in reason and not in desires and just religious beliefs. And of course, he's famous for putting forward the categorical imperative to act in such a manner that we would want everyone else to act in a similar manner in similar circumstances towards all other people. And the idea of using people as ends rather than means, because that's what we would all want to have happen to us. That is kind of boiled down to the golden rule, which is to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But ultimately, MacIntyre says it's not good enough, it's not a coherent argument, because we can find that many things can be universalized that Kant would not like. Many different ways of life or many different recommendations for how to live could be universalized. Now, I'm not so sure that MacIntyre's critique of Kant is good enough. It seems kind of cursory to me. I don't know if he has a good reason for rejecting the Kantian golden rule. I don't know if it really fits the spirit of Kant's recommendations to say that I could universally will that everybody follow their own self-interest. I will that everybody should be able to get away with the acts that they want, just as much as I will get away with them. Something like that is what MacIntyre is suggesting, and this is the one area of his argument that I'm not sure I got enough of a rationale for. But I do see the larger point that Kant's golden rule of basically do unto others as you would have them do unto you is a restatement of the Christian notion of the same, without attributing it to the Christian source. And his larger point seems to be that these Enlightenment thinkers really didn't quite escape from the Aristotelian Christian heritage, but they kind of replicated it without having the same underpinnings for it. He talks about other Enlightenment philosophers like David Hume, whom he dwells on. Many philosophers wanted to argue that if people really truly understood their long-term self-interest, they would know that it would be better to think about the common good and to see their interests as intertwined with the interests of others, and so it would be rational to uphold the freedom and the rights of others as equal to your own. But of course, now here there are many objections and many exceptions, and MacIntyre says, this is easily knocked down. What if I figure out a way to do exactly what I want to do without anybody else really ever finding out? Or what if I just value personally a short-run outcome better than long-term interest? Who's to tell me that my value of the short-term payoff, the immediate payoff or immediate gratification, isn't just as good as the long-term one? There's not a really good answer to that. So again, MacIntyre is suggesting that these philosophers also had this hangover of the Judeo-Christian and earlier Aristotelian influence, and didn't acknowledge it, and really couldn't establish their preferences any better on the basis of their reasoning alone. So always, in his estimation, there was this prejudice, this preference still. He says underlying their view was an implicit, unacknowledged view of the state of the passions in a normal and what we might call reasonable man. And he says the project of providing a rational vindication of morality has decisively failed, and from henceforward the morality of our predecessor culture and our own lacked any public shared rationale or justification. So, I take this to mean that for a long, long time, there was still this preference for basically, Christian ethics. But there was this desire to ground those Christian ethics in the new scientific Enlightenment way of thinking that didn't rely upon reference to a higher power or to natural law. And this went on for quite some time, and it produced bad philosophy because ultimately there was no really good reason for people choosing one moral or ethical conclusion over another in the Enlightenment and then existential philosophy. And then chapter 5 is why the Enlightenment project of justifying morality had to fail. Here he starts off asking the question, had these Enlightenment and existentialist philosophers really escaped the teleological way of thinking, the way of thinking of Aristotle, in which the we understand the ends of a particular being first, and then we can evaluate their goodness or badness based upon those ends? Had these newer thinkers really escaped this teleological way of thinking, or were they just replicating it without acknowledgement and justifications? And so, true to his going backwards in intellectual history, he hits upon the scientific revolution, and I think this is where the process or the undoing begins in his mind. In the scientific revolution, you get this beginning of this distinction between facts and values, and the idea that you can reason about facts but not values, and so therefore you can reason about means but not ends, which are kind of formulated arbitrarily based upon feelings and cannot be subject to reason. He says anti-Aristotelian science sets strict boundaries to the powers of reason. Reason is calculative. It can assess truths of fact and mathematical relations, but nothing more. In the realm of practice, therefore, it can speak only of means. Well, now, having more or less made the argument that the modern and Enlightenment philosophy, all the way to existentialism, has existed with this Christian hangover and hasn't been able to actually justify the moral precepts that it still wants to uphold by any other means, in his view, he then turns to the teleological alternative briefly in this last chapter, or I should say in the last part of this chapter. He says the teleological alternative that's associated with Aristotle derives ethical norms based on a thing's function. So, for instance, if we call a farmer good, it's because he has fulfilled the function of a farmer, which naturally involves the successful growing of a lot of food and in a way that allows for it to be sustainable. In this way of thinking, we can move from the is to the ought. We can look at what a farmer is, someone who provides food for the community, to ought, which is he ought to do certain things and be a certain way, because those are the ways and being that allow him to produce the food for the community over time. And then he says this reasoning is older than Aristotle. And that's interesting, and it's true. Teleological thinking is a sort of natural way of thinking in Alistair MacIntyre's view. He says once the notion of essential human purposes or functions disappears from morality, it begins to appear implausible to treat moral judgments as factual statements. But this is exactly what predecessors were able to do, to treat moral judgments as factual statements. This is, I think, both the most understandable part of MacIntyre's argument, but also the most controversial part. To treat moral judgments as factual statements based upon the function of a particular thing or human being is to say that there are certain things that are essential to human beings and to other things in the world, and that these essential functions should dictate the oughts, that is, what it is they ought to do, and that we should be able to assess their moral goodness or badness on the basis of whether they have fulfilled their function. This is essentialism. Okay, so the reason why it's controversial is because it seems to hem people in, to basically say, if you are this, your function is this, and to be good is to fulfill your function. So if you decide that your function is something different, then you could be deemed bad by this way of thinking. As a woman, as opposed to a man, what are my main functions? Well, it would seem by nature that one of those main functions would be to be a mother. Because I alone, as a woman, am capable of being a mother. And so does that mean that I have fulfilled my end or my telos only if I am a mother? Well, I hope that kind of gives you some idea of why this type of thinking is controversial in our modern world, because we associate freedom with the ability to define ourselves and our trajectory, not by any sort of supposedly biological functions that our body might serve. I'm sure on more on that as we go along. Finally, he just returns to the idea of the embedded self, which is articulated best by Charles Taylor in A Secular Age. But MacIntyre says, for according to that tradition, the older Aristotelian teleological position, to be a man is to fill a set of roles, each of which has its own point and purpose. Member of a family, citizen, soldier, philosopher, servant of God. It is only when man is thought of as an individual, he says, prior to and apart from all roles, that man ceases to be a functional concept. What does it mean to be a man or a woman if it is apart from these roles? That is exactly where we're at in our society now. A concept of freedom as detachment from those supposedly natural roles? Well, that gets us into questions of whether our biology determines us in any way and whether that's a problem. And so there are reasons why MacIntyre's way of thinking poses a real challenge to our concept of freedom these days. And so as we go on into the book further, I'm sure that question will come up more and more. But hopefully I've elucidated a few of the big ideas from these two chapters.